today we're going to cover part one of the release, which is usually focused kind of just on going through the release notes, talking about what's updated, what you need to know about this release. Typically we do demos in the Servoy Tech series. Unfortunately, this one is more informational. Excuse me. I'll do a small demo in the middle. Pardon me. Then on Thursday, we'll get to doing some more demos of some other stuff. So on the agenda for today, and really what's new, 2020.06, our Q2 release is out as a release candidate in beta form. RC2 is already available, and we'll probably be issuing the final build in about a week or so, depending on how many more issues are filed, etc. In the core of Servoy, we've done, I counted more than 70 fixes or enhancements. This particular release, we really focused a lot on quality, both in the core, but also in extensions. We're usually adding new features or new components, etc. This one, as I'll go through it, we also focused a lot on kind of quality and a bit of house cleaning in how the extensions are distributed and making changes to go forward. So we'll go over those as well. We're still building some binaries on the extension packages this week, but we'll be having the rest of those wrapped up with release notes and everything pretty soon. The main sort of core, or I shouldn't say core extensions, that's a paradox, but the most common extensions are already built, and we'll cover those today as well. Then on Thursday, we'll do some demos. There's been a lot of enhancements in some of the grid components, so I think that makes for some nice demos, and it's a really common use case, so it's applicable to everyone. So Thursday, we can look forward to more demos. In the core updates, we made a lot of optimizations in the IDE, and I'll go through those. First of all, script building, so that is the kind of processing the IDE needs to do in order to give you things like code complete or build markers or that sort of thing on your own code, has really been optimized. We improved our dependency graph, which really means that we don't have to check so deeply in the parsing your code. We now actually create a dependency graph, so we know that file A depends on file B, depends on file C, and if you change, file C, then we know which ones need to be updated. So that means that we can rebuild faster. We also removed some circular references to also improve build times. So that's just building code files. We can do that much faster now. We also reduced the memory footprint, so we did take a look at how our builds are done and realized that we're duplicating references or objects, and that leads to a greater memory footprint. So we fixed that to bring down the memory footprint. Something that you ought to know about this, I mean, apart from just the optimization, is there is a preference, or there was a preference at one point here we added for you could untick non-shallow parsing. What that means is if you have a pretty big, dependency graph, we only go a few levels deep parsing an individual file, and so that was unchecked by default, so that we would only go a few levels deep. You could enable deep parsing through a preference. And then your builds would take longer, but you would definitely get code complete anywhere from one spot to another, or build markers in some references from one spot to another. Because we now have this improved dependency graph, we are removing that preference, so we're always on always on shallow parsing, I should say. So it's really recommended that you use JS doc tags. I mean, it's always been recommended, but now even more so that you use your JS doc tags, particularly for parameters and return types in methods, so that the parsing engine can really understand what depends on what in your code. So it's kind of up to you to take advantage of those JS doc tags if you're not already. Along IDE performances, we also improved overall project building. So I was just talking about script building specifically, but now we're also tracking changes against dependencies for other objects in your project, which means we can do more incremental builds and fewer complete builds. So you may have seen before, you change an object, I don't know, a value list, a relational form or something, you save it, and then it's building, and you may have to do a deep build or a full build before it's done. Now that does run in background, but it does take up some processing. So now what we can do is just do more incremental builds and tracking really only what's changed, what's dependent, and what needs to be rebuilt. The sort of caveat of this is that in order to do this, we need to do a full dependency graph, which we got to do on startup. So we do a full build on startup every time now. So you'll have to be patient with the full build on startup, but this means we get better performance throughout once you're running the IDE. Another thing that we're doing to optimize performance in the IDE, database schema are loaded in background. So this is when you create a connection pool to a database. What then happens, the subsequent action that happens is we load the schema of that database so we know about it and we can build things around it. And that typically happens on startup. And so, or if you're editing a server connection or something, anytime that connection pool is reinitialized, and then you kind of sit there and wait. Typically this is fast. However, if you ever work with Servoy developer against a remote database or a database where the connection to it is compromised, then retrieving that schema information can really slow you down. And so now what we do is we do it in background and then update it. So it doesn't really slow you down. You can go on with your other work while it's doing that part of the build. More enhancements in the IDE, and this is one that I'll be able to show. We've changed a bit or enhanced a bit the form editor palette. So this is the region of the form editor that shows what components you can put on a form. And we no longer show the package where the component comes from. Instead, we've created categories that a component can expose, and we show those categories. So those are a lot more semantic, things like input control or buttons and text or whatever, rather than the package that it comes from. Because originally, the components are put in web packages really based on kind of their shared dependencies, and they have names like Bootstrap or ServerWay Extra. And that's really not very intuitive, like what package means what. And so now we kind of just hide the package and show what kind of components there are, and multiple packages can show multiple categories. So you'll see that it's pretty, it's a lot more intuitive. Also, in the filter box on the palette, it always hit on the component name or the package name. Now it also hits on search keywords, which can come from the component spec file. So you could be searching for something like an image and you type in icon, or a calendar and you type in diary, and it still hits. And we'll be kind of playing with what keywords are meaningful, but just to make it a little bit nicer to find a component once you have a lot of components in your project. Another thing that's new, this is not really in the IDE, but in sort of the project structure, is we added a solution version property. So this goes in the solution settings. And we did this for a couple reasons. Mainly is that when we're importing solution modules from our own distributions for things like search, utils, pop-up filter, all of those nice modules that are shipped as extensions and available through the Servoy package manager. When you're importing those actually have dependencies, and you can imagine that one module depends on a certain version of another module. And so now we're actually codifying the version into the solution property so that we can really check that it's going to include automatically the right module, or if it notices you have a dependency that is perhaps a version too low, it can prompt you and say, hey, do you want to get the the required version of this dependency for the thing you're trying to import. So I can actually go through that and show it and how that works. What this means is that you have the option to put a version, and you can use semantic versioning. It's just a text field on the solution settings. It doesn't really do anything for you, except that when you go to export, it's then required. And then if you're, sorry, when you do a binary export, not a WAR file export for deployment, but really for interchange format, when you do that export, it's required. And then also if you are exporting modules as well, you can specify the dependency of those modules. Some updates to the sort of core distribution. This is a big change. The Servoy default legacy component package is now deprecated. We've been wanting to deprecate this for a while, and the reason is that this component set is largely to be compatible with the legacy clients of Servoy. So our legacy web client and our smart client, our legacy desktop client. We actually had full compatibility of components, so that when the NG client was new, projects could easily migrate to the NG client because the forms that you designed, the components you put on a form, were largely compatible in the NG client. So we supported all those properties that, you know, like border or background color, things that are now controlled with CSS, are all in those components. So those components are really bloated and to be able to be backward compatible. And it also meant that all our enhancements are going to go and have been going into new components. So we haven't really been enhancing those for a long time, and they've been stable for a long time. One downside is that they show up all the time, and then people who are new to Servoy or building new projects, they just kind of keep using them. And it's really, I think, a problem that if you keep using them, because they won't be enhanced. So maybe you want to get a nice new feature on one of those components, and it's not going to happen. You have to switch to another kind of component. For that reason, we want to make it sort of very obvious and difficult to use them for new stuff. So they won't be available on new forms, and forms already having them will show, but if a form doesn't already have them, you won't see that component package in the palette. It's just not available. Now, there's a global preference to re-enable it so that you can see it everywhere. So if you have a project that's really dependent on those, don't worry, you can just go in, check the preference, and you keep on cooking. Also, we're not removing support for them. It's just that we want to get them kind of out of the way so people stop using them for new stuff. There won't be any enhancements, but there haven't been any enhancements. So that's not really different. So if you're really tied to those components, don't panic. Just change the preference and you'll be fine. I would encourage you to try to move toward the newer components as soon as you can, though, because you're really going to be missing out on enhancements that come down. A result of that is we did have to move certain components to other packages, because while we deprecated those, not every component had like a corollary in other packages. So for example, accordion pane was in a Servoy default. So we moved that already, or kind of rebuilt it in another package, and I'll go through those. It also means that in the form editor, some of the wizards, like a new tab panel, new split pane wizard, those are no longer relevant because they were sort of hard coded to go to those default components, and really components are extensible plug and play, so it doesn't make sense to have fixed wizards tied to components that you could swap in and out. So those go away as well. So it's really kind of a big change, but not a big deal. But it's good that you know about this, because you're going to definitely notice it when you try this out. So I want to pause right here, and there's more to cover, but I wanted to go into the IDE and show a couple of the things that I'm talking about so you get a feel for what it's going to look like. Okay. Rutger, can you see the Servoy IDE? I just want to check that it's visible.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right, so this is, I made a solution called demo. I made one form called test, and I did nothing else. By the way, when I made the solution, when I was prompted to install some common component libraries, I unchecked them so that I really want to start playing. So this is a new solution with no packages or extensions in it whatsoever. Now, typically what you would see here are the Servoy default, because they're automatically embedded in your project. And you can see that one thing that I do still have are form component and list form component under the category form containers. So these are still kind of part of the core that will always be available. You don't have to add them because they're really not components, extensible components so much as a container for placing other form components inside a form. And so those stay in kind of the core and kind of the default and are always available. So if I were to just come in here and say, no, I want to revert, I want to go back to the way it's always been, you can go to Window and Preferences, and under the Servoy menu, there's an item there called Default Packages, which has been there because these are prompted when you make new stuff. But you can check this back and do Apply and Close, and you'll see that the form editor refreshed, and now good old Servoy default is there, and I'm able to use it. Now, suppose that I'm going to drag a button on this form and save it. So now my form has a hard reference to the Servoy default package. Now, suppose I were to come in here and put this back to the way it is. So this is the default way it's going to be now, where those are hidden, and I apply and close. In this case, for this form only, the Servoy default package will show in the palette, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to work with this form so much, or continue to add components similar to what's on this form. So what this means is if you're moving from earlier version of Servoy to 2020.06, don't worry, you're using these components, they'll show up on your form, and this will show up in your palette for those forms. For new forms, you might not see it. So if I were to go ahead and delete this and save it, now I have to kind of refresh the form editor, but suppose I close and reopen this, it's going to go away again. So it's always going to check to see if they exist on the form, and unless you have that preference ticked, it's not going to show them. The next thing that I want to show is what the other component packages look like in the palette once you've added them. So if I click on this Add Components button, you'll see it will bring up the Servoy Package Manager. And we have some new component packages released here, and these are really the three most common ones: Bootstrap, ServerWay Extra, and ServerWay ng-grids. And so I'll just go ahead and add Bootstrap components, because this is really your kind of replacement for Servoy default components if you have been using those. If I go back to my form, you can see the palette is now updated. And I used to see one category here that said Bootstrap components, and it would list all the components there. And I always thought it was confusing especially for new Servoy developers, because they see Servoy default, Bootstrap components, ServerWay Extra components, right? And they don't mean anything. They're just the names of packages, and sometimes the components are very similar, especially between Bootstrap components and ServerWay default. So now the recommendation is use the Bootstrap components for a lot of the really basic type of components, and don't use the ServerWay default unless you don't want to go through the refactor yet. So you can see that the components are now each component, and for those of you who build your own components, this is also important. Each component can expose in its spec file the category name. And you can see that we had list form and form components here under form containers, but the tab panels and the accordion pane all show up under form containers now. So it just goes down the line with buttons, text, input controls. The other thing I would point out is we have a category here called mobile. There were some components in the Bootstrap component package. I think it was called data list, and it was really meant for like a native looking list box, you know, for mobile devices, and not really meant for desktop browser type applications. So that's been renamed and refactored a bit. So now we actually show for really mobile only or mobile specific components, they show up in the mobile category. It's still all coming from the same package here, but you as a developer shouldn't have to worry about it. If you're new to Servoy, don't worry about it, because this is the way we would want you to see it anyway. But if you're already experienced, then you're going to have to adjust to this. If I were to go and add more components and do the say the ServerWay Extra components, you'll see that the categories pretty much stay the same. However, we have now even a few more in each category. You can see the table component shows up under grids, and now under media, some of those file uploads and YouTube embedders, we have a category media. So the number of categories should remain about this big, fairly small, so that we can really categorize everything nicely. If a component doesn't expose in its spec file a category name, then it will show up under its package name, just the way it always used to. So if don't worry, you don't have to do this. If you make your own components, they'll just show up however you have them packaged. I'm going to add the ng grids. By the way, these are brand new binary releases for these 3 component packages, and they're all available today. And you can see now that Power Grid and Data Grid show up under grids. So I think it's a lot more intuitive. If I'm looking for grids, they show up there. Again, if I type in grid, I can filter on that. Components, as I said, can also expose search keywords. So suppose I have a lot of components in my project and I'm looking for, say, a diary component. Diary, the word doesn't match calendar or inline or input control, but these particular components expose that as one possible match on a search word. So we're going to add more search terms, but we added that in there so that as a spec, so that it's easier to find components, and we can kind of figure out, people can make requests about what is a nice synonym for a component name. So we'll be improving that. I'm going to leave this in the sort of state that it's in, and I'll come back to it to demo a few more things. We'll go through some more of the overview here. Maybe I should pause right here. Rutger, do we have any urgent questions that we should answer about what I just showed?
Well, we have some, so maybe that's the right moment to answer them.
Okay.
Because one is about some are about the components.
Mm-hmm.
One question is, which components will be used for the add fields wizard by default?
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering that as well. So the question is about there is a wizard here that will stay there. This place field wizard. So without any change, you could see the Bootstrap components are selected. So we made a slight change there. I think those at one point were all the Servoy default, which it really shouldn't be, because if we want people to use these components rather than the legacy ones, then they should be the default. So so those are now selected by default. Now this has always been that you can choose it and override it and create different configurations. So if you put back the Servoy default, you may certainly choose the Servoy default here for your configuration as well. But it will default to the Bootstrap for those.
Okay.
Good question. I'm glad because I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, and then there's one other question. If it is possible to raise a warning on forms in ng clients, which are using the old Servoy default components.
Yeah, you know, we that's an interesting question, because we discussed that internally initially when we were writing some of the user stories for improving how components are organized in the IDE, and we decided that we wouldn't raise a warning for because a lot of people will be just have like a gazillion warnings, and we didn't want to create a panic situation. You know, that you may want to ignore some of those but fix others, and it would be hard then to see the forest for the trees. So there isn't a warning that says you're using a legacy component on a form. However, if you want to find legacy components, I think you could do a workspace search on the package name, because they do show up in the FRM file. But maybe that's a good feedback or a good takeaway is you know, what's the best practice for doing the migration and identifying if you're using some of these, because they are there, they won't break, and we don't even warn on it today. So we'll have to look into that.
Okay. Yeah, I got another question about the build process, but maybe we can do that at the end.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Because well, I'll come back to the IDE because we have a few more things to cover and go over. I want to talk about a couple of the real common component packages that were released. We did a major version bump on the Bootstrap components. And the reason is that, well, we had to add components to this and add some features to this to really support the reorganization and the deprecation of the legacy components. So we added an image component, which is really a lot like the Servoy default legacy media component, except for the image component's a little bit enhanced. The media one had to be data bound to a data provider. The image one is flexible, can have a data provider, or it could just have an image from your project. So it's easier and more flexible. Accordion pane and combo box were moved into Bootstrap or created in Bootstrap because that was a gap that wasn't available. The actual combo box was the mobile one. So we did a lot of cleanup here. It was kind of mobile only. So if you put the Bootstrap combo box on your form, it would look funny on the desktop browser because it was really meant for mobile. So that one is the native select, and then we have a regular combo box as well. So now it makes a lot more sense. We also added a native list, which is the corollary to the legacy list box. List boxes aren't so common in browser applications anymore. And so, but it does look more like that native type list box that you might see on a mobile application. So those 5 components were added. So definitely Bootstrap got a major version bump. And as you'll see, there's also some properties that were added to label and data label to support stuff that happened in another package. So, and that is this. The ServerWay Extra components, which is another really common library, did get a major version bump as well, because we moved some components there. Split pane, which is like a tab panel with two forms and a divider. HTML area and spinner all moved there or were created there because they are gone in the legacy components. So we still there was a gap to fill. So those are new and they work pretty much the same. Deprecated components, this is important. In ServerWay Extra, there was on render label, which is a kind of label that can, basically you put a style class, like a calculation that returns the style class, and it can dynamically change how it renders based on some data value. This is really helpful in grids or list forms to show that, you know, it might switch from a status green to a status red or something, depending on the status field. That was always a separate component, but it's really just a total duplication of label. And then the same for Font Awesome label, which was, it had a little bit of default sizing, but you still had to go and set the Font Awesome classes. So we got rid of those because they were really redundant and a bit confusing that you had all these different kinds of ways to place a label. So now we added 2 properties to both label and data label in the Bootstrap package. So we deprecated these from ServerWay Extra, and we added style class expression to labels in Bootstrap, so you can set that now. Any label can dynamically change style. And then any label can also have a font awesome or a glyph icon image style class. One thing that I was going to show in the IDE that I had mentioned was the version property on a solution. You'll notice if I click on my demo solution, there's a version property here. I set it to 1, but it's just in the solution properties. When I go to import a solution from the package manager, and you can do that, here, download, install with package manager, and go to modules and get things like SVY search or SVY utils. It will check the version of the module you have, and if it's a dependency of the one you're trying to import, it can warn you to change it. So I'm going to go through an exercise here and add not the latest SVY utils, but something older. And it's still running. And what I'll do is, after adding the older version of SVY utils, I'll add the latest version of SVY search, which depends on SVY utils, and you'll see that it's going to scan it and prompt it. If I add SVY search with no dependencies already in my workspace, it will also just add it, even though they're not shipped together. So we're really able now to manage. This is more on how we distribute extensions to you. We're really able to manage dependencies better and have your project check for dependency, verify dependencies better. So now you can see I have the SVY utils module in my build path. And if I do the same thing, run the package manager and go for the latest version of search, and now it's going to prompt me and say, hey, you got 1.3. You want to go to 1.141, and I can click yes, and then it'll also update the dependency. What's changed as well is the version number that you see here is also, this really is maybe more of an advanced case, but we had to support it end to end. So it's also required when you do a file export. Not for deployments, but for binary interchange export. So if I export a .servoy file, you can see that it's picking this up from that version property. But if I didn't put it in, it's never required. It doesn't really do much until you go to export, and then it's going to tell me that I need to do it. It's not going to let me finish the export without it. So I could put in. We recommend to do like semantic versioning. I could put in my version number, and now it says, hey, you've got these here. You can choose to export. This has always been the case. You can always bundle your modules in your export, but even if you don't, whether or not you do or do not, you can specify, what's the version that it depends on. And then that way, if I go and then import this, it will definitely check that I have the right version. So this is mainly for us because we use Servoy to build dependencies and distribute them to you guys. So this is mainly for us to control that so that your projects don't get their dependencies all messed up. However, if you're doing this kind of thing within your own teams, then you may also want to take note of this and specify the versions here. And in fact, it's required. So that you can do dependency type checking, dependency checking. The other thing that I wanted to point out, I mentioned the deprecated components here and some of the properties. You'll see that some of those components, these components showed up. The other thing I wanted to point out are a couple of properties on Bootstrap label and data label. So here you have now buttons and text. It's really simplified. There's just a few components you need to know. And if I place label here, I now have a style expression class, which I can put to a data provider a calculation, say returning, warning or success, for example. And this is well documented in other webinars and documentation. The other thing I can do is I can do an image style class and do like a font awesome, something like that, and then I'll get the font awesome icon there. So we added that to label and data label, and all data label is the same. This was already in the Bootstrap, but that just has a data provider property, so it does direct data binding. So that's the only difference between those two. But apart from that, everything's consolidated there. So I did just want to point that out. So I think that's all that I wanted to demo. I have just a few slides more of some other little odds and ends in this release, and then we'll definitely do some more fun demo stuff on Thursday. We did some API additions. You may remember we released a couple releases ago, 2 new types of data sources or found sets, the view found set, which is a lot like the memory found set. So these are found sets that can be generated off a SQL query. And we brought the APIs of those classes up to be more in sync with the regular found set API and the regular record API. So things like determining if it has edited records or figuring out what the change data is, right? Because these are editable found sets. And so the API should support the same type of thing that you see in the regular found set. So those are pretty close to being in sync. We still don't support working with failed records yet, and like record.exception or view found set get failed records. So we don't fully support that yet, but it's got a lot more methods in it now, so you can check that out. We also added an API for you to manage memories if you're working with in-memory data sources. Typically what will happen is that you'll create a data source that makes a temp table, and then that stays in memory because it's meant to be like a dedicated data source through the lifetime of your client session. And so it will stay in memory whether or not you're using it, because it's supposed to act like a data source. However, that can cause a bit of memory overuse depending on how you use it. So now we provide the API for you to take that out, so you can kind of decommission a memory data source when you're not using it. So it allows you to control memory management. Finally, just some last few things. There is a warning now that gets generated when you use the solution model if you use a invalid form name. And I'm guilty of this all the time, because if you're making forms that need kind of like a randomized name or guaranteed to be unique, often is the trick to use a UUID. UUIDs have a hyphen in them. You would never be able to do that in Developer. Solution model has let you do it, but there are some cases where it can cause issues. So now you'll get a warning if you call solution model new form and you give it an invalid form name. It will still work just like it did before, but you'll get a warning. If you want the warning to go away, do things like replace hyphens with underscores and you'll be fine. I just wanted to point that out in case you see it. And finally, we did some stack updates on the IDE, including Eclipse. The Java that we ship, the OpenJDK that we ship, is now bumped up to 14. And we bumped up the HSQL driver. That's the driver that supports the memory data sources. We bumped that up as well due to some issues that we discovered in our earlier version. So not that you need to know all this, but these are nice to know that the stack is being improved. So I'm going to leave up some of these links where you can download, where you can watch recordings, where you can provide feedback, and take any more questions that we have.
Yeah, we have a couple.
Okay.
Someone is asking, with the new build process where the add parse.js doc tag, is that recommended or necessary?
Okay. Yeah, well, the JS doc tags are never required. It's just commented code. It doesn't affect your runtime. It does allow the builder to parse your code and do things like warn you if you passed in a string when your method says it takes a number. So it's always been recommended to use them because you get a stronger build. stronger type checking and such. Now the change that we added where we don't allow you to do full parsing, deep parsing anymore, it really does it based on dependencies. We'll look at those for the dependencies. So if you're not providing them, then you may not get full type checking or code complete on your own stuff. So it's recommended, and it's always been recommended, but now even more so.
And I guess the documentation will be updated with an example of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really, nothing has changed. The JS doc tags haven't changed. The standard hasn't changed. It's just now recommended more. So yeah, there is documentation on JS doc tags, and it's available, and it really hasn't changed.
Then I got a question about the database schema load. Is there a visual indication of when the background database schema load is completed?
Yeah, you know, I was wondering the same thing, but I was working with a local database preparing for this webinar, and I was wondering the same thing. I think it's in the corner of the IDE. Bring that up here. You'll get down here in the right-hand corner where it shows background processes. Just like when it's building or launching NG client or activating a solution or whatever, it will show background processes running there. And I think that's where it shows up, but I'm not 100% sure because I wasn't able to reproduce it.
Yeah. Okay.
Good question.
There's in the extra components, somebody's asking where the site nav is.
Yeah. So we added a category called navigation, and it comes down under there. And when you add, say, Bootstrap Extra components, there's navbar in Bootstrap Extra. It'll also come in. So you have side nav and navbar will both come in under navigation, and some other things too. I forget which ones. So. Yeah, that's where that lives, and I think it's a lot more intuitive than rather than them showing up in totally different places when they're pretty similar in functionality.
Okay. The version property. Can the version property be read inside the solution for an about info form?
Yeah, it's funny. We were just discussing this. No, we haven't added that to an API like application get solution version or something. So we're looking to add that, but currently you can't do that. You might be able to get it from solution model. I'm not sure, but we plan to add that to a top level API, and we were just discussing that. In fact, so that one's kind of missed.
Okay.
Yeah, what's typically done is people put a constant somewhere in a top level scope, and they increment that, and it's under version control. So you can still do it that way, but yeah, it would be nicer to get it right from the metadata.
Yeah. And then somebody is asking if it is possible to get the version number of the module in code.
That's the same question, I think.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. So not yet. I think we might be able to sneak that in before we make the final two. I'll have to talk to R&D.
Okay. So far, no other questions.
Okay, I see. I saw a follow up from Steve about there's the doc on the parse tag.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think our documentation probably has to be updated on that. I'm not sure if it's done yet, so I'll check. That's a good point. Thanks, Steve. Okay, we're through all the questions.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. I know it was a bit longer when we do these release webinars and more slides and less demo today. Thank you guys for your attention, though. I hope this helps you in the update, and we'll be back Thursday with more demo, more fun stuff.
Thanks for joining. See you on Thursday. Bye.
Bye-bye.